Welcome to the Cables to Clouds podcast. Cloud adoption is on the rise, and many network infrastructure professionals are being asked to adopt a hybrid approach. As individuals who have already started this journey, we would like to empower those professionals with the tools and the knowledge to bridge the gap.
And welcome back to the Cables to Clouds podcast, everybody. My name is Tim. I'm your host this week, and joining me as always are my lovely compatriots, Alex Perkins and Chris Miles. How are you guys doing today? Chris, what's going on in Australia?
Not much, man. I like that intro you did there. Welcome back to the Cables. That was pretty nice. That was slick.
I've been practicing all day.
Yeah, man, not much. Had a very busy work week, but I'm in lovely Sydney. You can probably hear the birds in the background. They're enjoying this lovely Saturday that we're having. Yeah, man, I wish I had more to report. It's been pretty boring few days, but I think Tim and I are working on something very special that I think by the time this releases, we can probably talk about it. So should we reveal that, Tim? Should we talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the purpose of the episode, but I think we might, by the time this comes out, we probably will have let the cat out of the bag anyway.
Yeah,
so yeah, absolutely.
So Tim actually got approached and reached out to myself and another previous guest of the show, Steve McNutt, about writing the new certification guide for the AWS Advanced Networking Specialty Exam from PACT. So yeah, you'll probably be seeing more on that. But yeah, we've kicked things off. We're writing, and we'll hopefully have that out to you in a timely manner. But yeah, I'm really excited to do that, Tim.
Yeah,
thanks for pulling me in.
Yeah, no worries, man. I'm glad to have you. What about you, Alex? What's going on this week?
I also have had a pretty boring week. I don't know what it is about this week, but almost everyone is out of the office for some reason. So I've been just catching up on a lot more like paperwork stuff, building out various documents when I can't be bothered by all the people that are gone. So it's been kind of nice, but yeah, that's it.
Yeah, all right. Well, I guess that's all. So all the pressure's on me to talk about something interesting that happened this week. No, it's fine. It's fine. I got this. So my youngest daughter did a Girl Scout STEM camp this week. So she had science, technology, engineering, math. I was really, really happy to see that. We went over there yesterday, actually. They were launching bottle rockets. So like different rockets that they created. It was pretty cool, actually. It was a fun little thing. They had a bunch of girls down from the... I don't remember all the Girl Scout like ranks or whatever. I'm sorry, I don't. But kids are 6 years old all the way up to I think like 14 or 13 or 14 years old. It was really cool to see. So that was fun. The other thing is, of course, we're finishing up. I got a little bit more time left before we pack up and go to Japan. So I just bought new luggage for Japan.
My condolences.
I know, right?
Right.
Not that. Yeah, no, it's not cheap anymore. That's for sure. But the old one I had, I'd taken all over the world with me, and it was beat to hell. So it was time.
It's funny.
I needed a good excuse.
You say bottle rockets. Immediately, I think of the fireworks that we.
The fireworks. Yeah.
It reminds me of, dude, like we used to we were reckless with those things, dude. I remember you remember the old lightsaber toys where you could unscrew the top and that's where the batteries went in? We would take those, we would take the handles, we'd unscrew the top, take the batteries out, and it was basically just like a hollow tube, and you'd put a bottle rocket in, we'd just shoot them at each other. It was the most dangerous thing I've ever done. But, yeah.
The Girl Scouts did not do that.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so we have a new guest to the show. We're actually really excited to bring this guest on. I'm really glad we could connect and get him. This is Peter Jones. Peter is a distinguished engineer in Cisco networking hardware. Sorry if I could say that right. And also the chair of the Ethernet Alliance. And the reason we connected with Peter actually is kind of a funny story. We had released our episode about the economies of scale stuff, and in there, we'd been talking about kind of the race to capture silicon, but among the CSPs and all the hardware vendors and stuff. And Peter had some really good insights for that. And then, after we talked to him for a little while, he had way more insights than that. And so we were like, man, dude, you got to stop talking. We need to get you on the show so you can share that with everybody. So Peter, thanks for joining us on this one.
So you're welcome. I do want to mention, you guys may not have had much interesting to talk about, but I'm just recovering from 2 weeks in Europe, where the first week was attending a Ethernet standards meeting in Berlin. And I can tell you that Berlin in July is lovely, and directly outside the hotel was a nice beer garden.
Oh my goodness!
And then my wife and I, we basically took the train from Berlin to Brussels, Brussels to Paris, and Paris to Quimper in Normandy. And we spent 5 days on a bike trip riding around Normandy, eating crepes and drinking cider.
Oh my God!
Oh man! Wow,
dude! Yeah,
you just made up for all of our lackluster weeks.
I'll send you some pictures.
I love how you have to use the term recovering from such a delightful 2 weeks.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah. But I mean, so coming back and getting over jet lag and stuff is always a little tricky.
It is.
And getting back into the, I actually have to work for a living instead of just like hanging around and drinking cider. And cider and crepes are so cheap. I think I bought a reasonable bottle of cider in a store and it was like €5.
Jeez.
Oh my goodness. All right. So this is not related to the topic at all, but I have to know, savory crepes or sweet crepes?
Yes.
No. Yes. The answer is yes. That's a good answer. The answer is yes.
What's interesting there is they call them different things. I think it's a galette is the one that's made with buckwheat flour, and that is always savory. And the crepe is made with wheat flour and is always sweet.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Cool.
Yeah. And they serve you the cider in little cups.
Man, that's awesome, dude. I love crepes. That's really cool.
Yeah. So future episode recording.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Actually, I am sort of wondering about this because I know there's some friends that do whiskey and wireless, and I'm wondering on a Friday afternoon whether it could become what would rhyme with the C. I have to figure this out.
Yeah.
So for a future episode, right? Make sure there's some alcoholic consumption in the process.
Clouds and crepes and cider sounds pretty good.
Clouds and cider. I think it was whiskey and wireless was the show I knew. It was a couple of guys getting together and drinking bourbon and talking about Wi-Fi.
That's a great idea. We'll have to see if we can work some drinks into the next episode. See, he's got great ideas.
It's only 9 a.m. for me, but nothing's ever stopped me before, so it's fine.
Well, so here's the thing: you're an Australian. You're in Australia, and it's always past midday somewhere in the world.
Yes, exactly.
That's true.
One thing that I mentioned this on the show.
Should we get back on track?
We will, but let me make this point. I mentioned on a previous show, it was amazing to me when the Super Bowl aired here, how many people were still going to the bars at 10 a.m. to just get sloshed and watch the Super Bowl. It was a true testament to the culture here.
Yep, I remember talking about that.
Well, yeah. So my first job out of college was on a mine site in northwest Australia in the Pilbara. And it was not uncommon to get up having missed breakfast because we're in single men's quarters, miss breakfast and have beer for breakfast.
Absolutely. It'll wake you right up.
Very nice.
All right, now let's get on track. Tim, take it away.
All right. Well, no, I mean, I kind of set it up, right? There were so many cool things that Peter had brought up that we really wanted to get him on the show and in front of everybody just to talk about it. And like I said, what kind of spurred us to start the conversation was about the idea of all the CSPs and the hardware vendors and businesses, are all competing over the same silicon and the shortages and everything. And we kind of use that as a launching point. So I guess, Peter, is that a good place to get started, or how would you like to start this off?
So I guess the area where I'm most directly useful here is generally how Ethernet is moving around, how it's developing.
Oh, yeah.
So I've been building Ethernet switches for a long time now, and I also chair the Ethernet Alliance, and we're at 50 years of Ethernet. And on the sideline, Ethernet has the biggest dynamic range it's ever had because we're working on 10 megabits and 1.6T at the same time. Clearly for very different purposes. And it's interesting to see how, the transition has been, 10 years ago, maybe 15, it was the service providers who were the bleeding edge. And they were low volume and high margin. And now the CSPs, the web scalers, are the bleeding edge, and they are high volume and very low margin. And they really want to take everyone else's margin out of the business.
Yeah,
but
that's
actually, so just as an interesting sideline, I was writing a thing for Ethernet Alliance today. It was a piece for the fast mode or somewhere else. So I'm writing about slow Ethernet. Someone else is writing about fast Ethernet, like high speed. And I just did a quick look with some numbers. As it turns out, the predictions for 2027 say that of Ethernet switches to DC in campus, more than 75% of the ports is at 1 gig and under.
Really?
Wouldn't have guessed.
2027.
2027. It's, because we all get wrapped up around here's the really new cool thing, right? Because this is exciting. And we actually forget what actually makes the bills. So I just wanted to drop this in there as a let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's really cool to understand where stuff is going, but it's also really cool to understand what matters now, right? And if you lose track of what matters now, then you don't serve customers anywhere, right? Because almost the worst thing is, it's if you have the right product at the wrong time, right? You're not helping.
Yeah.
If you're a long way ahead, and for customers, there's always what's the risk reward? Depending on who you are, what resources you have, you've got to make very different choices based on your risk profile. In the enterprise world I live in, refreshes on switches are like 7 years.
Yeah.
Now, that's very different to where you might see on a CSP where they can afford to gut something every 3 years. And so I think, the thing that you guys know and I try and keep in my head is there's not one size fits all. And your first thing is, what are you trying to achieve? And, what's your risk balance, right? Where do you want to be in comfort level? Because there's really good reasons why some people, like in the OT world, are a little bit behind adopting stuff because it really matters.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm looking at the Cisco headquarters, right, building 10 is where all the higher ups sit. So in the worst case, if we lose the network in building 10, everyone can go out to lunch. All right, if the OT network goes down and the elevators stop and you can't get out, that's a bit of a different problem. And so the OT, let alone if you're in something like an aluminum smelter or for Chris, an aluminium smelter, when you lose power, everything freezes. So taking into account the risk profile of the customer, I think, is really important, because otherwise you recommend the wrong solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in terms of like OT or like, you also see this in government and medical and stuff where, you tend to not see the bleeding edge adoption because you need that stability.
I mean, so there is always the old thing about you never want to buy any of the first set of cars in the market, and there's a good reason why for most products you release the first one as version 1 dot something, because no one ever wants to buy 0.7.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do we want to head back to if we go back and think about Ethernet in the cloud providers? First I'm going to separate. And let me make it clear, I wear a bunch of hats, right? There's some of them in the background. There's the Cisco hat, the Ethernet Alliance hat, and there's the me hat. And so the me hat is sort of the synthesis of things, I think, right? Not speaking for anyone else but me.
Right.
But if you look at the cloud scale providers, there's in the DC, there's really their IT network and their production network, and they're very different. And in their IT network, you'll often see the normal vendors, the USs, the Ciscos, the Aristas, et cetera. But in their production network, it's almost all their own kit. It's the white box stuff, and it's there for a bunch of different reasons. But partly it's there because I think they don't really care about failure, because everything can start up somewhere else at the same time, right? So if you lose a rack, it's not a big deal because it just swaps over, and so their appetite for risk is much higher, because eventually, if there's a failure, they'll get it just load sheds and no one cares about it. But they're also very picky about exactly how they design that network. Having looked at a few of them, right, every cloud service provider thinks they have exactly the right answer, and they're all different, which does make it a bit of a challenge for the providers. It might be different in terms of what the radix is, they're all going to build it different. I know I talked to Russ White about this at one stage, and it's like, there's good things and bad things about how much money these guys have. But the bad thing is they all have enough money to really decide how to do it themselves.
Yeah, right.
And so from a vendor point of view, it gets really hard satisfying them all because they're all different.
Yeah, and like every other year they come out with a new demo of, oh, we've upgraded. Like Google has gone through so many iterations of their internal like GCP network. It's crazy. You can find literally almost every year they'll come out with a new presentation about a new like complete paradigm shift that they've done on their internal network.
And they can go and write their own protocols and everything else. And so it's it's a very different world to where we were, even 5 to 10 years back in terms of stability, what was happening, and the amount of power that those particular customers have. But it's always, you guys may have heard the saying that, one way to go out of business as a small company in America is to get a deal with Walmart, right? Because they will beat you down on the price. And I think the cloud providers are somewhat the same. They just have so much power. Anyway, but that all being said, they're driving to very high speeds as much as they can. So this is where the push is coming to, a little while ago. So probably in 2015-ish, it was pushing towards 10 gig to the server and 100 gig lift to spine. Then it's gone through 50. Now it's going to go to 100. At the minute, IEEE is working on 100 gig per lane, and then speeds of 200, 400, 800, and 1.6T. It's going to be interesting to see which ones of these end up being adopted. If you think about... no, they'll all get ratified, but not all standards succeed. If you remember the long time, the motto in 802.3 was 10 times the speed for 3 times the price. That was a great motto, right? Until we tried to do 100 gig and it didn't work very well. And so if you remember, basically the first 100 gig was 10 by 10 and it was very ugly to use.
Yeah, right.
And we did 40 gig because 40 gig was easier.
Yeah.
And you sort of end up with a 1-lane, 4-lane story, which then went, 10, 40, 25, 100, 50, 200, and it sort of works well for mass adoption. It's a little bit less clear in the data center because they could potentially re-engineer that stuff much more, but it's still not easy, right? Even though if you can change a rack, changing the rack to spine connections is not a simple thing. As you guys well know, inside the DC, inside the rack, it's probably all DAC, right? Maybe active optical cables. But once you get out of that, it's multi-mode fiber. And of course, what's happening is pretty much, in general, every new speed actually needs a new grade of multi-mode. So it all gets, even though they can change a lot of stuff, it actually does get a little hairy. So I'm sort of a believer in the 1-lane, 4-lane story. And so then, 800 gig, I think, makes most sense when it's 4 lanes of 200. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
But to some extent, it's depending on what the SPs, the web scalers are trying to do. Because the workloads for, search and storage and everything else are one thing. But as everyone knows, right, everyone's little black dress at the minute is AI with large language models, LLMs.
Yeah.
Because everyone's been going through ChatGPT, which is a great resource online, as one lawyer can tell you who used it to file his case and did not work out well. And so those networks are actually being built very differently to even the normal production network. So in my head at the minute, you've got an IT network, you've got a cloud service provider production network, and then you've got the AI training networks, and they're different.
Okay, how are they?
And that's what I'm glad you asked him. And so I went to this conference the other day called the SmartNICs conference, and the only reason I actually went was because they asked Ethernet Alliance to come and give them like a 10-minute pitch on Ethernet. And I tried to get one of my other colleagues who's in the SmartNICs area to go do it, and he couldn't, so I went instead. But the whole discussion at the minute, because of all the noise around this large language model training, as you well know, everyone has their own. Right? There's ChatGPT and there's Bard, and
right, everybody's developing their own.
Yeah, everyone's doing this in a great hurry. And I don't know if you've been tracking it, but there's been a bunch of stuff recently about there's people doing research, and they're finding that in general it's pretty easy to get around the quote guardrails that people are putting on these things.
Yeah.
Because I think the guardrails are actually, they're just trying to filter out input. And surprisingly enough, people doing input are really creative. Yeah, put that to the side. So, and you probably want to find someone who really knows this stuff better than I do. So here's what I understand about how you build that network. It is a dedicated network that's fully homogeneous and is built specifically for this task. In an ideal world, it is non-oversubscribed. And you might have, you might be serving somewhere between 1,000 to 32,000 GPUs. And you go, that's a big network.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. The model training can take a long time, where long time being in order of months to complete one full task. So a fully homogeneous network that's running for a month with nothing changing is a pretty unusual network.
Yeah, and not an easy task.
It's like, if you give enough money, you can build anything. But no oversubscription at all is also a very different network.
Yeah, so I was thinking of.
That's the most foreign concept to me out of that, is not oversubscribed. That's something you never even consider.
So in the enterprise, we tend to think that oversubscription from access to distribution is probably 20 to 1, right? So we're used to that. But also in enterprise, you really optimize power for idle, where in DC, optimize for active. All right. So, and here's why this is supposed to happen. And again, right, I'm sure we can find people who explain this better. So the way they do this is they break this workload up and they split it out to a whole bunch of different GPUs. So each GPU basically gets some data, is told to go and work for a while, and then it has to share its data with everyone else. So it really is a control, work, control, work, control, work. And they can't start the next work phase until everyone has shared the data. Now, I think the data is quite large, so it is not just a single message. So what they're trying to do is every now and again, I don't know whether it's 99% of the time or 9% of the time or something, everyone has to send data to everyone else. So the whole goal is to make sure that everyone communicates, and what they care about is the time for their last packet to arrive.
Okay. Since they need a quorum, basically, they all need to have the same. Yeah.
No, it's not a quorum. They actually need everyone agreeing.
Oh, good point. Yeah. So it's like you said, everything. Okay.
So that requires a lot of different things. It means things like, the load balancer we would normally use in networking just isn't good enough, right? Because, as you well know, Ether channel or ECMP is a hash and flow polarization, all this other stuff.
Right.
It's not helpful. Coordinating when people send stuff is tricky, right? You have to deal with fan-in. And so I believe, and there's a bunch of presentations I've read about this, and you can put them in show notes. I think I've sent you some already.
Yep.
So they're trying to solve that problem, which is quite different. And that's what I'm hearing about being called AI networking. And you're seeing stuff about it from Broadcom. They released, I think they call it the Jericho AI. Cisco Silicon One. I'm sure Mellanox has a similar thing. Everyone has their own flavors of this. But they're trying to solve that very specific problem. Now, for the time being, just imagine how much it's going to cost you to set up a couple of these clusters, right? The cost of networking is actually trivial because the GPU cost is going to kill you. You'll spend more on the networking because if you can reduce the time they spend communicating by 3%, right, you significantly increase the value.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a very cool, sexy thing, but I doubt many people are actually going to go and build one themselves.
Well, I would imagine the CSPs might be among the people who might do that. Maybe not to that level. Maybe they will. I guess it depends on whether they think they can monetize, essentially pass that cost on along and make a profit off of it.
This is, I think you'll find they're already doing it. This is what the Microsoft will be doing for Bard, what Google will be doing for its one, what Meta will be doing.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I was going to say, wasn't there an announcement around, was it OpenAI? Someone was, I thought they were running theirs in Microsoft data centers.
Like in Azure, I think you're right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, how long is it till all of the CSPs have agreements like that? Right.
So I think the pre-meeting, at least we were talking about this, we were saying, well, what size company would you have to be to set one of these things up? And I think
have it make sense. Yeah.
I think the answer is unless you're doing this all the time, you probably don't. So there probably becomes a market for the cloud service providers selling, basically letting you rent time on their training cluster. Selling
cycles, yeah. Say just what they do now.
So we used to call this bureau computing in the old days, right? So it's a sort of an interesting thing, but it's off to the side. And so then you say, if your goal is to build this with the minimum, with no jitter and minimum completion, you basically build it differently. And there's a whole bunch of ways people are thinking about doing it. One is to basically use telemetry and basically start it running and then adjust things as you go to reduce the impact or collisions. And if you're running this thing over a couple of months, you can probably do that. There are other people. I mean, I think at the minute, NVIDIA can do a bunch of this with InfiniBand because InfiniBand gives you this sort of properties. but I don't think InfiniBand scales with the price performance that the CSPs want. So even though NVIDIA likes InfiniBand a lot, I don't think that's the answer. So then the question becomes is what else do you do? Now, I think since we talked, there's actually been a public launch of a group called the Ultra Ethernet Consortium, with a whole bunch of people in it, including Cisco and Broadcom, maybe Broadcom, and a bunch of the other CSPs. And they're really trying to define the characteristics of what this network looks like. Now, they're listing the work they're going to do, including physical layer, link layer, and transport layer. So they're looking potentially at all the layers of what they need to do to make this work. There's not much information on the website, but they do have a white paper which sort of explains what they think it needs. So we can stick a link to that in the notes.
Which we will.
If I remember, the only CSP on there is Microsoft. And then you have like Facebook, which I was going to bring up as one of the few companies outside of a CSP that
could do it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It'll be fun to watch if more come on or build their own standards or how all that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, in the world, there's roles for vendor organizations versus standards, and they're sort of different. And the way I tend to think about it, standards are really bad places to develop technology. But they're really good places to make sure it becomes common and usable. And so you see this in a bunch of places in terms of various consortia pushing together things. And basically, you tend to see them as eventually enough people go, yeah, this is a good one. And so then you have to come in and make some compromises for standards. But, with this particular one, I think they start up under the Linux Foundation, and they're claiming they can do, as I said, physical layer, joint layer, transport layer, and software layer. So they're trying to do everything. So it's going to be interesting to see, as you said, do they get critical mass? At the minute, I think they said, so Microsoft and Meta are in there. And so for the time being, I'm sort of consuming Meta as a web scaler, right? Whether it's a cloud service provider or not.
Right.
That makes sense.
And the other guys listed are AMD, Arista, Broadcom, Cisco, Everton, who I don't know who that is, HPE, Intel, Meta, and Microsoft.
So a lot of the vendors, yeah.
There's a fair bit of weight in there, but there isn't AWS and there isn't Google, let alone all the Chinese guys.
Yeah, so, I mean, those are definitely missing. That's an interesting omission
NVIDIA.
from that alliance or whatever, from that group.
So often there's often competing efforts rolling around the place, and then you have to sort of see which ones end up winning. It's not quite Lord of the Flies, but it's sort of like that. So we'll have to see who makes progress and how it looks. Yeah. But again, my understanding of this is it's a topic of interest, but it's a bit like I really want to understand how the Formula One car is built. It's a very cool thing, but I'm never going to buy one.
Obviously,
well, I mean, adoption is king, right? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
No. Finish your thought.
Well, I was going to say adoption. I mean, how many times have we seen vendor develops, thing, and then, later on, either it becomes the standard or the vendor has to adapt and then, to the new ITF standard or whatever. And it seems like generally adoption is king there. So no matter how good the technology is or isn't, it's going to end up who ends up using it. And that determines.
So I worked on a standard which was 802.17, which was resilient packet rings. And it was an excellent standard. It was very well written and it died. So it's not the case if you build a better mousetrap. So, you're right. I think the key thing becomes ultimately what drives adoption of standards is how suitable they are for the use case, how consumable they are. I mean, sometimes you get the standards, the tech geeks, we go and we find something, we say, this is really cool, like 10 by 10 for 100 gig, but adoption is really hard. Or, even single mode, until recently was hard because terminating those things was nasty. So, if I go back in time, according to the books I read, when Metcalf invented Ethernet like 50 years ago, him and Dave Boggs. He spun out a company called 3Com, which was the first Ethernet company. So originally when they started with 3Com, hang on a second, I have show and tell.
This is for our YouTube.
All right, show and tell.
Viewers only.
Yeah. Sorry, we'll have to describe it for for everyone else. All right, what do you got there, Peter? Oh, I think he's having to like dust it off.
He's opening it. It might be in a sealed package. He might be ruining resale value on whatever this is.
Is it
Okay, this is the original Ethernet cable.
Wow.
There you go.
I don't have a vampire tap to put in, but this is it, and it's not nice and it's heavy.
Jeez.
Because the idea was they were going to run a cable down a corridor between offices, and they would then put a tap in from each office.
Yeah.
And after that, we went to this. You guys use
Cheaper? Yep.
I did.
Very exciting. And as a side note, do you guys know David Bumble?
Yes.
I do, yeah.
One of the things he's done is he has a YouTube on that where he basically builds a real functioning network from 10 base 2 and 10 base 5. It's worth taking a look at.
It'll work.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
Amazing.
if you have the taps and everything, it'll work, right? So for the audio viewers, Peter's been showing off some really nice old cables. I think he actually had to go dig them out of the the vault to bring them back up.
Where was I with this thought? So the real question becomes is what problem are you trying to solve and how is it adoptable? And the story I was going with is, so early on, 3Com had just got their first 10 base 5 product, like the CheaperNet product working. And so they called up Steve Jobs and said, Steve, we got this great thing. You want to come down and look at this because this is just wonderful. And Steve comes down, they show him, and he gives them a normal Steve response with a large number of swear words and then says, why don't you just plug it into the telephone cables? So this was the time that the telephones were getting deregulated in the States, so people owned their cabling plant. So 10 base T could run over what was there.
Yeah, right.
So that was the case. That was the one that made sense.
Yep.
And then you go, okay, so for every new technology, what's its adoption path? So when 25 gig was first defined, it was defined for 100 meters of multi-mode for the DC. And for campus, that was just not helpful.
No.
So I actually was involved when we spec'd 25 gig single mode, and we spec'd it to be the same requirements for the 10 and 40 as 10 gig was, with the idea that it ran 10, it would run 25. And then we went and built a transceiver that did the same thing. Because in the campus world, your existing infrastructure is key. You can't change that.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you go in the DC world, things are a little different, but it's still not clear to me that I want to change design patterns all the time. Now, in the DC world, what you tend to be nowadays is, at one stage it was like, we need more and more processing in 1 RU. That doesn't actually work anymore because now you're limited by the power you can get in and the heat you can get out of a rack unit. So now it becomes more interesting, right? How much work can you do per unit of power?
Yeah.
That's right.
And if you think about it, there's a lot of conversations about what we might want to do with liquid cooling and immersion cooling. And I think these things are all fun, but I don't think they're actually broadly deployable. The engineering challenges are just huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
To get liquid cooling in all those racks. Yeah. I would agree completely.
Or run all the servers immersion cooled, right? It's a very cool thing to see.
Put it under the ocean.
But there is, this is the Formula Ones, and there's the rest of our stuff.
Exactly. Like Chris said, just build a data center under the ocean and that'll solve all your problems.
Well, actually, I think someone did that, right?
Microsoft. Yep. Microsoft did.
Yes.
But so if you're going to see broad adoption, there's this interesting window of what's consumable, right? What is close enough to solve the problem at a price you can afford that can actually be deployed at scale.
I think it's like maybe the Venn diagram, right?
Yeah, and I think the cloud scalers have just changed what some of those scales look like. And on similar technologies, there's a trend that says, look, we can't keep doing modular optics, right? And the problem is that if you look at, for instance, the 25 or 50, 51 terabit chips, and you look at what the power in that system, a lot of the power is spent just getting the signal from that chip from the optics module, because SerDes is really expensive. And so people say, well, why don't I put the optics on the board? That's what Cobalt was trying to do. Or why don't I pull it inside the chip itself, which is what co-packaged optics does. It'll be interesting to see, again, whether those are just the things you do when you can't do anything else, or whether they actually are what end up being dominant. And I don't know the answer. But you always have to take a look and see this first thing that comes out, is it really deployable at scale by a bunch of different vendors that it can stick? Because often the first things that come out, they're they don't stick for a long time.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
makes
yeah,
sense.
absolutely. Not to derail this
Yeah,
too
absolutely.
much, but I mean, obviously, we talked about the
Beware of people building. Actually, sorry. Beware of people building, making gifts, right? Because if it sounds too good to be true, it probably
exactly.
is.
Yeah.
Not to derail too much, but I know we talked about this Ultra Ethernet consortium, right? And I'm sure we'll probably dive into the ideas that they've kind of put into this white paper on how to solve this problem. But just a side note is obviously this is like a standards based thing that is going to ultimately the idea is to increase interoperability, right? And create standards, right? So do we think that these things kind of fall flat on their face? Because I mean, if I'm looking at this, in which this is brand new to me, I don't know much about this, but like I look at the founding members, and a lot of them are obviously in direct competition with each other. So how does the interoperability work in their favor?
Did you ever read an RFC? They're like all it's like filled with vendors that hate each other.
So let's talk a little bit about how stuff gets defined. So you have cooperation, and you see this most clearly in like the IEEE standards. So if I'm in a standards group, in 802, the rule is everyone gets to vote, and you need 75% of the room to agree to make the decision. So the room includes my suppliers, my customers, and my competition. So getting 75% is always tricky. The idea of a standard is where you decide that you're better off making one playing field that everyone can compete in than lots of playing fields. Now, you look at the Ultra Ethernet Consortium, it's got a bunch of people in it, but a bunch of people missing. So we're at the stage in general, most of the tech companies know they can't own it all themselves because no one wants to be locked into one company.
Right.
There's temporary things like NVIDIA have pretty much a lock on the GPU systems at the minute. But whereas at one stage x86 and Intel dominated the processing, you're now starting to see ARM and other people come in. So in general, no one ever wants to get stuck with one company. So there's a benefit for people to say, look, if we work together, we can get a good solution. Now, if you go look at that set of members, right, it is chip suppliers, system suppliers, and some consumers. And you can, as a web scaler, build your own entire system, but then potentially you end up in a bad place because if you have to build a chip that no one else uses, the volumes go down.
Yeah, that's true.
So the web scalers, what they want to do is they want to have common things produced at high volume that they can leverage. So, for instance, if every one of these groups tried to do something different, no one would sell any product. So, and it's always a competition because you get if we keep it to ourselves, we'll make lots of money. And you look at people and say, well, if you keep it to yourself, most people won't buy it because they don't want to be stuck into a single vendor strategy.
Yeah.
And so I think for the more mature competition, it's like, okay, how do we make a market bigger? Now, normally what you see is everyone will do standards plus. They'll do the standard plus they'll do their own special thing.
Right.
And you can see this in if people are using the cloud, right? Cloud computing sounds like a great plan, but as you guys know, it's somewhat of a roach motel. It's easy to get in, it's hard to get out. Now, if you're trying to do a multi-cloud strategy, that's wonderful, but then you can't use all the nice optimizations everyone offers you.
No, that's true. Definitely.
So I think what you want to do in like a standards organization is get together, towards the minimum criteria to be useful, and then go sell it. I mean, standards like documents, right? You're not done until there's nothing left to take out. Because the more things that get put in a standard that aren't used, right, the worse it is. So this consortium, which I don't actually know very much about, is obviously they've been working for a while at this. It'll be interesting to see whether they can get the other major parts of the world agreeing to it. Now, even if you look at the other guys being the Googles or the AWSs, that's one side, but then you start getting all the Chinese cloud service providers in as well.
Yeah.
So I think what's being
like
recognized
and stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All those guys. Now, of course, dealing with them at the minute is always tricky outside of a standards org. But you need to get down to a common agreement on this is going to work for a bunch of people, and then we can start building in volume. I mean, before that, if you have to build fundamentally different products for every company, right, there is no way that anyone ends up in a good state.
That makes sense. I wanted to step back just a little bit because I think we might have glossed it over a little bit before. Something you said that I liked, and I don't think we had spent enough time talking about it, maybe, or just laying it out for the audience. You mentioned that like the network that we're going to build for low level models for like training, AI training, is going to look different. Large language models. I'm thinking, large language models is a different network than, for example, the CSPs will leverage for its customers, which is different than an enterprise will build, different than the CSPs will use for themselves. One thing I think we glossed over a little bit is like how would we consider them to be different? Like we know an IT organization, like for internal IT or something like that, is going to look different than a CSP or network built for customers. We know that, right? But like if we start talking about the large language models and throw that in there, like how do those two? Because the CSPs, if they're going to offer it as a service, are you thinking of like they would be like completely two different separate networks and they would interoperate, or like how do you feel about?
So you want me to start making stuff up?
Yeah, well, I mean, just really, it's, and I know you're it's all speculative, right? That's the whole point. A lot of this is very speculative. But what's your thinking about
this is
that?
all on the record.
So my gut. Yeah. So
yeah, and we're holding you to it, by the way. We're recording.
Yeah. So this opinion was worth exactly what you paid for it. So here's my gut feeling. And again, this is based on my current understandings. The training of the large language models requires a specialist dedicated resource to go do it. The more normal processing, I think, and the inferencing, I think, that becomes the general production network. So the general production network has, normal compute, some acceleration, some storage, short, long-term storage, etc. But that's built how we've built a DC today.
Okay.
On the side, there's this other job that you're going to go off and run this one job for 2 months, and it's just a different piece of stuff. Now, the result of that is some large data file, which is basically your language model. So there's going to be some transfer between them, but from a fundamental operational point of view, what I think is going to happen is those LLM training clusters, they're just off to the side.
Okay. So almost like a container type of setup where they just kind of have or essentially worker nodes, and they go produce some data and come back.
Because the worker nodes are fundamentally different, right? Those worker nodes are just different. It's all GPU. So I think more like if you think about for the web scalers, there's their IT network and the production network. I think there's going to be the AI training network as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe that's not true at some low level, but if you're doing these huge ones, it seems to be. That all being said, I was also reading some stuff the other day that people were able to take some of the outputs of the large language models, like the ChatGPTs, and then re-implement them in smaller systems. So, I have to go and find a link. So, I think the answer is we don't know, but if what I'm being told makes sense, then it becomes a fundamentally different network. So you stick it off by itself, and you could basically carry the stuff between them on a large USB, possibly.
Sneaker net.
But I mean, if there's a function where you need to go and run for 2 months and not touch it, right? This is fundamentally different.
That is.
But I mean, like you said earlier, I mean, it's just a purpose-built network, right? Just for this thing. It's not oversubscribed, and that makes a perfect use case for someone like the CSPs to offer this as a service. A specific task, AWS would probably have a slew of service names they would give you to offer this kind of thing to build your own LLM, right? For your own consumption.
AWS would do it themselves
as
well.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess it's like, how do they do this on a shared medium too? Like that seems
Go ahead, Chris.
That seems overly difficult. If it's something that's not oversubscribed and
what shared medium?
I mean, if you're offering it as
you can do it. It just runs worse.
Yeah, true. I mean, like you said, it's all speculative. I can only take what my 15 years of enterprise networking mind can grasp in this concept. But yeah.
So, I mean, if you run this on a normal network, it's going to work. It's just going to take longer. You're just going to spend more time communicating and less time working.
Right. Yeah.
So the question is, at what point does the time out working make a difference to you? And if the answer is if you're running 16,000 GPUs you really want them working all the time. So the network, I think the cost of the network gets lost in the noise.
At that scale with that many
Scale.
GPUs, that makes sense.
And so your only purpose is how do you make sure the GPUs are working as much as possible.
You know what's funny is I was thinking about this when we were talking about it before, and especially about the idea of having all of these GPUs doing this task. And I was thinking, man, if they're not training large language models, they'd be making a ton of money on crypto.
Oh, we're not going to get into cryptocurrency. I refuse to go there.
Oh, come on, Peter, tell us all. I'm just kidding. You don't want to know my opinion either. So Anyway, I was kidding. But the whole idea of task based GPU working on the same task, it made me think of that type of.
I'm sure that there's the inferencing required. There's going to be lots of cases where they'll be adding, small AI cluster functionality stuff you can rent. But that's not these big, huge ones. I think the big, huge ones, the reason why they're going to go and spend all this time defining fundamentally new things is because they can't solve it any other way. If they could just use the standard protocols they had today, we'd be doing that already.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah.
There's something here too. This might be a crazy thought, but it's you're talking about having the CSPs.
A crazy thought on this conversation.
Well, I'm trying to think of something over here.
Get your tinfoil hat on.
You have the CSPs that are going to do these really large ones, but this kind of almost opens up a new space completely, where you could have like a different kind of CSP that rents out space for companies to do their training on, right? If that makes sense.
I don't see why. It's not the existing big ones. I don't see how you get to their scale without it.
Well, for smaller ones, right? Like if you have a smaller company that doesn't need to use the entire, like an AWS data center.
No, right. I absolutely agree. There's going to be some people who rent this out. The question is there a business model for a second tier guy to offer the service that's cheaper or simpler than AWS? Good?
Yeah, that's right.
Or
that's
GCP?
That's the question.
It's like, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, where's the margin on that one that you're going to, I totally.
But I think probably the reality of this is that's sort of the second generation of stuff, because you have to see it work first.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point for sure.
Cart before the horse on that one, because no one really knows what this is going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, at the minute, I think there's huge speculative investments being made, and I think the only people who can afford that it's the web scalers, because they have so much money and they see this as so important.
It's a gold mine for them, right? This is really right in their wheelhouse in terms of like provided service, right?
So it's sort of interesting. I'm not a ChatGPT user. Part of the reason I don't is because it hallucinates. But no one would write something without spell check running, and so it's going to be interesting to see how this fits into the world. I mean, I think was Copilot for Git that got in?
Oh yeah.
Certainly, there's. In my company, there was a "Thou shalt not use ChatGPT" message that went out, and I think it went out before the guys from Samsung managed to leak stuff out. But everyone is adopting this, and is it going to become, is it revolutionary or evolutionary? I don't know the answer.
We were talking to Yvonne Sharp about this as well. I don't know if you know Yvonne or not.
I do know Yvonne.
We all know everybody in this industry.
People.
I know that's true, right? And she kind of took the position that it was evolutionary, like it's here to stay, and it's going to be part of, whether we like it or not, it's going to be part of technology moving forward, right? It could, she took the evolutionary, I think, response.
So you guys, one of the things that's coming out a little recently is there's a really interesting question about intellectual property. So if you've trained your large language model on the entire web and you've sucked up some stuff that belongs to someone else, can you reuse it? And the answer is that's tricky. No one actually knows the answer to that one. But probably you can't. And so both data protection and intellectual property, I think, are a huge problem that no one has solved.
Well, I think they're solving it by ignoring it. Like I was going to ask you.
That is not solving.
No. I agree with you completely. Right. So I was going to ask you what your own personal opinion, not the Ethernet Alliance, not the Cisco hat, the Peter hat, on the fact that we have these very large companies with a lot of money hanging in the balance, fueled by that, that money that, are essentially racing to be the first to market, and the ethical and privacy and IP type of problems that are necessarily going to happen when people just stomp right over.
They're necessarily going to happen. So I also listened to some legal podcasts about the Supreme Court, and there was a case recently that was between the Andy Warhol Foundation and a photographer. So a photographer had taken a picture of Prince, and then Vogue licensed it for Andy Warhol to draw a picture based on it for Vogue. Then Warhol drew a bunch of similar pictures and then sold them. And the question in here was, the whole thing about is it fair use is transformative, and how transformative is it? And I think the answer is we don't know. I mean, clearly these models were trained on the whole web, right? And so they're trained on some material that was copyrighted by people. Now, even if you want to solve this, what would you do? I have no idea how you'd fix it anyway. But
how do you pull that out of the learning model? Like, how do you even identify it once it's in there, right? Like, it's like a Hoover vacuum. It just sucks it all up, and you have no idea what's even trained on.
What's funny about this, though, is like, you guys might remember this, but maybe within the last year, when the whole like metaverse stuff was coming out, isn't this what Zuckerberg was trying to do? He was trying to assign basically value, like you could pay in the metaverse to give like artists credit and stuff like that. And everyone was like, oh, that's dumb.
NFTs.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of similar. Yeah.
So an NFT, right? You bought a URL.
Yeah, right. You bought a receipt. You bought a receipt.
So on the metaverse thing, do you guys read science fiction?
Occasionally.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Have you read Snow Crash?
No.
Oh, is that Neil Stephenson, right?
Yes, the originator of the metaverse term. So Snow Crash and Neuromancer are absolutely worth reading.
I've started
I love
Neuromancer.
Gibson.
I haven't actually finished it yet, but yeah.
It's so good, man. If you're into cyberpunk, you're going to see like basically where cyberpunk began. It was such a good book. Oh my god!
And do you remember why Snow Crash was called Snow Crash?
It's been a few years. I'll be
because they
honest.
hacked people's brains. Their brains crashed.
Nice.
That's right.
I mean, the thing that I get from this, it sounds like this builds the use case why it would be valuable for someone to want to specifically build their own large language model. But the problem is, like, you got to have that amount of data to put into it, and who has that? The only things I could think of would maybe be like Meta or someone like that has all this like information just about people, but then like they own all of that, right? Because you probably sign your life away when you signed up for the account.
I mean, that's private privacy, right?
You could imagine effectively taking a mostly trained model and then putting it on a vast amount of data you have yourself. Mm-hmm. For instance, let's say you're running a factory and you have a whole lot of data on that factory. Maybe you basically take a partly trained model and you add your own stuff in, right? Which is not public data,
right?
But that's your model to solve your problem. Or maybe that becomes, if you think about it, I think, as far as I remember, Rolls-Royce do not sell you jet engines; they lease them to you, and part of the reason is they want the data.
Yeah, right.
So maybe they end up training a model and it becomes part of their service offering.
That's interesting. So
that
makes sense. So anybody basically who could run this LLM network basically could even package up and offer, in theory, the model itself as a product, essentially.
And then someone takes over and basically adds their customization with their data and then offers on top of it. I mean, you can imagine lots of things, right? Which ones are going to end up being product?
Who knows what we're actually going to monetize and what's going to be the actual product?
Google is over there like just dreaming about the new angles for ads and stuff they're going to get from this.
So you guys remember the saying from Yogi Berra, right? Predictions are hard, especially about the future.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting. I mean, I've now been in the business long enough to see it change from 9600 baud modems to 1.6T Ethernet. But I think mostly it's been evolutionary. I'm really an evolution, not revolution sort of view.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know where this goes. But certainly the volume of some of this stuff is going to affect pricing of other things. There is
Absolutely.
the original point you made, which is if these guys are buying huge amounts of this stuff, no one else can buy things. But then with supply and demand, you're going to end up with more people building stuff. So the acquisition of large volumes of this stuff over a long period of time is going to reduce the price for everyone eventually. And so that's a good thing.
Eventually.
Interesting. I mean, eventually. We need the air quotes.
If you want the thing first, right, it costs you money. That's the way of life.
That is how it goes. Yeah.
What's interesting here is that, compared to the old service providers, these guys are buying enough of volume that it makes a significant difference in terms of cost of goods.
Okay. I think that's probably a good spot to wrap up, because that's a good point to finish on. Yeah, we'll definitely have you back, Peter.
Because you know that if you don't wrap up sometime, I'll just keep talking.
I mean, we try to keep this around an hour anyway, just so people don't turn us off. But
don't worry, we're gonna.
So if you're still here,
we're gonna have you back
congratulations.
for round 2, and we'll do another hour. So we can.
Yeah, we'll bring
keep
it
this
back.
going as
There's
long
more
as
to
we have
talk
stuff to
about.
talk about. So yeah, this was great.
Yeah, it was. Really appreciate you joining. We'll see if we can get Lexi to join us next time. We tried to get her this time, but she didn't. She wasn't available tonight, so we'll definitely try to schedule it so next time you're on, we can bring Lexi in too, because she loves to talk about Ethernet.
Queen.
Yeah, I know.
She is the Ethernet queen. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up, guys. Any final thoughts? Won't everybody speak at once, please?
I think their brains are.
I think they're melted.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. They slagged their brains.
No, man, there's just so much here that I need to dive into and read more about.
The goal of me coming here was not to actually tell everyone everything about it, was to sort of try and set the scale so people can provide context so people can fit in what they're hearing, right, into a worldview. Right. Yep. So you can sort of start to picture, pieces of, well, this is where this goes and this is where this goes. And so, I'll thank you for putting me on, because I like doing this stuff, and hopefully this gets good consumption.
Yeah. No, thanks very much for joining us, Peter. We'll go ahead and end it there. Of course, if you've been listening this long, the odds are pretty good that you're already subscribed to us. But if you are not, please feel free to subscribe to our podcast. Visit our website, cablestoclouds.com. View us on YouTube. Subscribe to us on your favorite podcatcher. I don't know, buy us at Walmart, whatever the hell you can get us. So we'll be happy to have you.
We can't cut a deal with Walmart. Peter already said that. We don't want to. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. We'll get driven out of business. Sorry, forgot about that. So, all right. We'll see you guys next time on Cables to Clouds. Hi, everyone. It's Tim, and this has been the Cables to Clouds podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe to us in your favorite podcast catcher, as well as subscribe and turn on notifications for our YouTube channel to be notified of all our new episodes. Follow us on socials at Cables2Clouds. You can also visit our website for all the show notes at cables2clouds.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.